Are you ready to confront pure terror? Turn on the lights. They won't save you. We're opening the doors to a world where darkness doesn't just blind, it consumes the soul. Here, in the darkest corners of the night, even your breath can become a harbinger of nightmares. Question everything you knew about safety and comfort. Are you prepared to hear eerie whispers from nowhere, invade your mind, and torment every thought? Leave your fears at the door, because what we show you will make them burst forth.
In a small town surrounded by dense forest, life had always been peaceful. Children played in the streets, the elderly sat on benches, and parents didn't worry about their little ones enjoying themselves on playgrounds. But one day, everything changed, and from that moment, the town became known for its horrifying events. On that day, when the town was under the scorching summer heat, a group of children found something unusual by the roadside. It was a row of lollipops, neatly lined up. They were colorful and bright, irresistibly enticing with their appearance. The children, not thinking of any potential dangers, began to take the sweets one by one. They enjoyed them with joyful delight, unaware that these lollipops would bring horror and death. The first troubling sign appeared when Kate, a little girl who took one of the lollipops, went missing. That evening, she went to bed, but woke up to find her room unusually dark. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, and her breathing became labored. Kate tried to turn on the light, but the lamp wouldn't light up. Her room filled with a low, unnatural hissing sound, which seemed to come from deep within the floor. When the girl touched the wall, she felt cold hands emerging from it, grasping her fingers. Her hands became covered in a sticky black substance, slowly but relentlessly creeping towards her face. She tried to scream, but her voice was muffled by the dense layer of darkness. Before she completely vanished, she saw her own reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were filled with an endless void. In the morning, her parents found Kate dead in her bed. Her face was pale, and her hands clenched in agony. What or who had taken her life? The terror began to spread through the town as news of missing children started appearing everywhere. The next day, Dennis, one of the children who had also taken the lollipops, heard a quiet knock at the window. He decided to check who it might be. But when he approached the window, there was no one there. The knocking continued, and with each tap, it seemed the town around him was being swallowed by more and more shadows. Soon, Dennis heard the knocking again. Now it was louder, and a sense of dread filled his heart. He decided to go outside to investigate. It was dark and eerily quiet outside. He walked a few meters, when suddenly, shadows began to dance around him, transforming into horrifying figures with grim faces. His legs gave way, and he fell to the ground, watching as the shadows began to wrap around his body. He felt the darkness start to fill his lungs, and with each breath, his breathing became heavier. The darkness wrapped around him like a cold flesh embrace. It began to squeeze his heart, and an endless void appeared. As Dennis struggled with his fear, he suddenly saw the faces of his friends appearing around him, laughing at him with cruel satisfaction. One of his friends, with a dead face and empty eyes, suddenly appeared before him, shouting loudly, "You came to die with us!" In his last moments before death, he felt his consciousness splitting into parts, and everything around him became blurred. The shadows turned into terrifying creatures, whispering in his ear and evoking a sense of horror. He felt his breathing slow down, and finally, everything turned to darkness. Dennis disappeared along with the darkness, and his body was found lifeless, covered in a cold substance that seemed alive. Over time, a heavy cold began to hang over the town, and the atmosphere became increasingly ominous. The remaining children were full of fear and didn't go outside. The town became a place where even adults felt that something was wrong. Shadows were everywhere, and the elders recalled ancient legends that began to come to life again. One morning, an old portrait appeared on an old bench in the park, the face of a child with a terrifying, detached expression. Traces of liquid black pigment dripped from its eyes, and the inscriptions on the painting looked like bloodstains. "We're waiting for you." On the scariest night, another trial awaited. George, the last of the remaining children, decided to find out what was really happening. He decided to spend the night in an old abandoned cabin on the outskirts of the town, which everyone avoided. He prepared himself for the night's horrors, but what he experienced was more terrifying than any of his worst nightmares. When George fell asleep in the cabin, the darkness began to spread around him, creating eerie sounds and rustling. Shadows began to appear on the walls, and voices, seemingly coming from deep within the floor, began to whisper his name. George tried to stop his heart from exploding with fear, but everything around him started to seem alive. Suddenly, a skull with burning eyes burst out of the darkness, staring at George in horror, and with a thunderous crack screamed, "You won't escape!" Shadows dancing on the walls suddenly came to life and began to move towards George. They were like living beings, with terrible, distorted faces expressing horrifying emotions. George felt the darkness start to wrap around his body, and he sensed something cold and sticky slowly seeping into his skin. He tried to escape this trap, but with each step, the darkness only grew thicker. The shadows began to turn into terrifying faces of his friends and relatives, who laughed at him with cruel satisfaction. His heart pounded like crazy, and his breathing became heavy. The darkness consumed him, and everything around him blurred into blackness. George tried to call for help, but his voice was lost in the quiet hissing of the darkness. He felt the darkness tearing his consciousness apart, and the last thing he saw was a terrifying face with red eyes, watching him, smiling with cruel satisfaction. In the morning, when the town finally tried to understand what had happened and began searching for George, his body was found in the empty cabin, but with a strange anomaly. His eyes were black as darkness, and around his body was a black, sticky layer that looked like a shadow that had consumed him. Since then, the town has remained shrouded in a chilling cold and mysterious darkness. The shadows, now a part of this place, never allowed children to feel safe again, and the town remained forgotten and cursed, a warning to those who try to ignore the darkness. There is another legend that these horrors will never end, that each night brings new terrors, and each lollipop is a part of a grand plan of darkness that will never release its victims. And with each new case of someone accidentally finding lollipops on the street, there will be a chance for a new cycle of horror and death. The creaking of doors, shadows that appear and disappear, and a quiet voice whispering, "You're next." This is just the beginning of a new nightmare approaching. And now, someone is already standing on the doorstep. Will you open the door when they knock? Knock. Knock. So, are you ready for a new nightmare? Every sound in the dark, every creak of old doors, these are just the harbingers of what's to come. Your home, your safety, your sense of peace, it will all be destroyed. The shadows have begun their terrifying game again. Will you withstand this scream of silence, or will you disappear forever into the abyss of fear?